Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really undertaking a deep philosophical demolition job on something most of us just take for granted.
Oh, absolutely.
How do words actually connect to the world? I mean, forget grammar. We're talking about the deep plumbing of language.
Right.
What is the fundamental mechanism that ensures, when I say Aristotle, I'm actually talking about that specific ancient Greek philosopher and not just, the handful of vague facts I happen to remember about him.
Well, that fundamental link, it's shockingly fragile and complex, but it's also incredibly successful in practice. For centuries, the dominant philosophical intuition, the one that just feels right in your gut.
The common sense one.
Exactly. It was that the reference of a word, what it points to, was determined internally.
So by the knowledge, the set of descriptions a speaker had in their head.
Precisely. That's the traditional description theory, largely championed by Frege and Russell.
Okay, so let's unpack that central assumption. If the word water meant, say, colorless, odorless liquid that fills the oceans and quenches thirst, then the meaning is purely defined by those descriptions in my mind. But what happens if those descriptions are faulty? What if the stuff that actually fills the oceans isn't what I think it is?
And that is the critical point of attack. Our mission today is to distill the revolutionary counter-arguments that move past those intuitive description theories to what we now call the causal historical theory of reference.
We're moving beyond intuition.
We are. We're entering a domain of rigorous, naturalistic, and empirical inquiry that suggests a complete overhaul. The reference mechanism isn't internal to your mind. It's external, it's historical, and it's entirely causal.
So the central conflict we are framing today is this. Does the meaning of a word live inside your head and depend on the knowledge you possess? That's description theory.
Right.
Or is it anchored outside your head by an external causal chain connecting the sound or the symbol back through time to the initial object or kind?
And that external anchor is the key. Because once you accept this causal model, it introduces a truly, a shocking realization. The very structure and history of that causal link, not just the object at the end of it, that becomes part of the word's meaning.
All right, let's start this journey where the revolution really took hold with proper names. Because when Kripke introduced these arguments, he fundamentally shifted the overwhelming philosophical consensus.
He really did. He moved it toward an anti-descriptivist view for what we'd call paradigm proper names, like your example, Aristotle.
Right. I use that name successfully, but I certainly don't carry a perfect, unique description of the man in my head. Not even close.
And that's the beauty of it. The reference is essentially borrowed. It's not individually fixed by every single speaker's beliefs. Think of it like a viral meme or a chain letter.
Okay.
The causal theory posits two essential distinct processes for how proper names function in this system.
And those processes are grounding and reference borrowing. So can you take us through the core mechanism here?
So grounding is the initial baptism, right? The act of fixing reference. This typically requires a direct causal perceptual link to the object when it's the focus of a person's perception.
So someone literally points to the philosopher or the czar or the mountain and says, let's call him Aristotle.
Exactly. That sets up the first link. That's the anchor point.
And once that anchor is set, the entire community just starts doing the work.
The work of reference borrowing. Subsequent uses borrow their reference along a causal network from those earlier uses. You don't need to know the original context or even the original descriptions.
So my current use of the name designates the object because of this.
Yeah.
This unconscious shared causal network stretching back from my voice right now all the way to that first use of the name.
It's an act of linguistic deference. You're trusting the chain.
This sounds like a great theoretical model, but it needs to explain the empirical failures of the old description theories. And this is where the famous ignorance and error arguments come in.
Right.
This is the moment the internal description model really, truly collapses.
These arguments are fatal to it because they show that competence with a name is detached from knowledge about the thing named.
Okay, give us an example.
Take the name Cicero. I might be perfectly competent using that name in conversation, but I might be completely ignorant of most facts about him. I might only vaguely know he was some ancient Roman orator.
Which a lot of people probably do.
Exactly. Now, if reference required me to possess a unique and sufficient cluster of descriptions, my use should be indeterminate. It should fail altogether. But it doesn't.
So that's the ignorance argument. And even more compelling, I think, is the error argument, which directly challenges that internal link.
The error argument shows you can be totally wrong about your descriptions and still refer successfully. I might confidently associate the name Cicero with the description, the man who wrote the Iliad.
Which is completely false.
Oh, that
I
holds.
wrote the Iliad.
Demonstrably false. Yet, when I say Cicero was a great writer, I still refer to the Roman orator, not to Homer. The causal chain overrides my internal error.
Okay, I have to push back here a little just to play the description theorist for a second. Surely, descriptions have to play some role, even a small one.
What?
If my description is ancient Roman, doesn't that tiny, potentially shared description at least keep the causal chain pointed roughly in the right direction? I mean, it stops me from referring to a modern pop star, right?
That's a fair challenge. But the crucial finding from Kripke is that descriptions, when they are present, act as frequent identification tools, not as reference fixers.
What's the difference?
They help us confirm we're talking about the right point on the chain, but they are not the semantic anchor. If you and I share the belief that Cicero refers to the famous Roman orator, and then I suddenly discover he was actually an obscure Greek fishmonger.
An unlikely discovery, but okay.
Let's just say, I would continue using the name to refer to that fishmonger, provided I remain linked to the same causal chain. The shared intent to refer to the person initially grounded trumps our individual descriptions.
So the causal network becomes the primary semantic mechanism. If we accept this, then we need to clarify the scope. Are all proper names purely causal like this?
Not entirely. And this is an important nuance. We have to note that most names are designational, they are causally fixed, but a few are inherently descriptive names.
Okay, what's a descriptive name?
Well, the classic examples are those fixed by an attributive description, like Jack the Ripper, or, in a famous philosophical example, Julius, a name just arbitrarily assigned to whoever invented the zip.
So the reference of Jack the Ripper is fixed by the description itself, the person who committed those specific murders. Its initial link is descriptive, not perceptual. You don't have to see him to name him.
Precisely. Its reference is fixed by an attributive use of a description. But here's the key continuity. Once that reference is fixed, whether it's causal or descriptive, it can still be borrowed along a causal chain. Future speakers use the name based on the historical transmission, not by constantly reevaluating the description.
Okay, this system works beautifully in a smooth, linear historical chain. But linguistic history is, well, it's notoriously messy. What happens when that causal network gets tangled up? What about a designation change, like the historical example of Madagascar?
This is a fantastic illustration of the theory under stress. Historically, Madagascar referred to a portion of the African mainland.
Right, not the island.
Not the island. Then Marco Polo, during his travels, heard reports from Malay sailors about a great island and, well, he misidentified the name. He applied it to the African island we know today.
So we have two conflicting causal links. One chain going back to the original mainland portion, and a new, very powerful causal perceptual link to the island itself, established by a major figure like Marco Polo.
And the change in reference from the mainland to the island, it wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't dictated by some central authority. It was driven by a fundamental shift in the pattern of groundings.
So more and more people started grounding the name in the island.
Marco Polo and those who followed him, they started grounding the name perceptually in the island. They were referring to the island when they used the name.
The theory needs a way to account for that period of, well, profound ambiguity and confusion before the new convention stabilized, doesn't it?
It does, and this is where we can incorporate the concept of partial designation. We borrow this from the philosopher Hartree Field, who originally applied it to vague scientific terms.
Partial designation, how does that work?
In this period of conflicting causal networks, the term Madagascar can be understood as partially denoting multiple objects, both the mainland and the island, to a certain varying degree.
That's an incredibly rigorous way of handling ambiguity. It's like a word having joint custody over its meaning.
It's a great way to put it. The degree of designation shifts over time, following the change in the frequency and the context of groundings.
So eventually the island just wins out.
Exactly. If the original users and the confused users had separated geographically and never interacted, the name would have quickly become simply ambiguous, two different words. But since they mingled, the confusion was long and resulted in partial designation. It reflects the actual indeterminacy of usage until the majority of speakers adopted the island as the referent.
So the truth of a sentence using the name would have been partial too.
It would, depending on which causal chain was being activated by the speaker.
Okay, let's move from proper names to other singular terms that rely on these causal links. Demonstratives. If I point and say, that cat is huge, the reference seems immediately fixed by my perception.
Demonstrative terms like that, F, or this are definitely fixed by a causal perceptual link to the object the speaker has in mind, but we need to be precise here.
Okay.
We have to distinguish the physical act of pointing from the demonstrative term itself.
Why is that distinction so critical?
Because demonstrations are external aids, they're referring devices. But the core reference of the demonstrative term is fixed by the causal perceptual link to the object in the speaker's mind, whether or not the object is physically present or the speaker is pointing.
Ah, so the designating chain is initiated by the perception, but it persists internally in my mind.
Yes.
Which explains why I can say to a friend days after a party, that drunk at the party was boring, even though the party is over and the person's long gone.
Exactly. You are relying on a past perceptual grounding. The crucial link is the singular thought that the term is meant to express. It's a designating chain prompted by a causal link, like sight or hearing, but the term itself refers to that object because the chain is grounded in that object, even if that grounding is now just a historical memory for you.
So if we accept this causal mechanism for names and kind terms, we are forced toward a conclusion that truly destabilizes a lot of traditional philosophy of language. And we're calling it the shocking idea.
Yeah.
That meanings are partly external causal modes.
This is the synthesis of two major philosophical tenets that are powerful on their own, but revolutionary when you combine them. The first one is Platonian externalism.
And this states that reference is fixed by external causal relations in the world, not by internal definitions.
Right. So give us the classic example there, water.
Okay, so my internal knowledge of water might be clear, drinkable liquid, but the reference of the word water is fixed by the actual external substance in the world, HO. So if I had a twin Earth counterpart whose liquid looked and tasted the same, but was, say, XYZ, our internal states would be identical.
But your words would refer to different things. Reference is external.
Okay, so that's the first tenet. Now, what's the second one we're synthesizing this with?
That's the Phrygian thesis, which is often summarized by the idea that meanings are modes of reference.
Meanings are modes of reference.
Right. This thesis argues that if two words point to the same thing, but we treat them differently, if they have different cognitive significance, that difference has to be semantic. It's due to the way they point, the mode of reference.
And if we mash those two together, external reference meets semantic mode, we get the shocking idea.
Precisely. The meaning of a term like Aristotle or water is the partly external causal mode of reference. The specific underlying causal network, the way the term was historically transmitted and grounded, is itself semantically significant.
Now, why is this so shocking? It's because it directly challenges the highly popular direct reference dogma, or DIR. Some people reductively call it the Phyto theory.
Right, the idea that the meaning of a name is just its referent.
And direct reference became popular because it seemed like the logical next step after you reject description theories, right? If names don't refer via descriptions, what's left?
Just the object itself. But we argue this is it's insufficient to explain how humans actually think and act.
Okay, let's use the classic identity problem to show this deficiency. We have Hesperus, the name for the evening star, and Phosphorus, the name for the morning star.
And both, it turns out, refer to the same physical object, the planet Venus.
So if the direct reference theory is correct, the semantic content of Hesperus is just Venus, and the semantic content of Phosphorus is also just Venus.
Which means?
The statement of identity, Hesperus, Phosphorus, should be semantically equivalent to the utterly trivial statement, Hesperus, Hesperus.
That's the logical consequence. But historically and cognitively, Hesperus Phosphoruses was a major astronomical discovery. It was highly informative.
A rational ancient observer could believe the trivial one without believing the informative one.
Absolutely. And since the cognitive difference is so drastic, the difference must be semantic. It has to reside in the meaning of the names, not just in some external practical context or pragmatics.
And the causal theory resolves this by showing that the causal mode of reference is what constitutes that semantic difference.
Yes. The name Hesperus is associated with one causal network, one set of, let's say, mental files relating to observation in the evening. Phosphorus is associated with a distinct, separate causal network related to morning observation.
So these distinct causal networks, these external modes, they are the semantic difference makers.
They are. When the identity is discovered, it means two previously disparate causal modes have been shown to converge on a single referent. And that's why the statement is informative.
So meaning isn't just what the word ultimately points to, but the entire historical external path. The context of discovery, transmission, grounding, that whole structure is semantically relevant.
Precisely. This model provides a highly motivated, non-internalist way to rescue that Phrygian insight that meaning has to account for cognitive significance. But it does so without reverting back to the failed descriptive theories.
This externalist revolution forces us to reject two core traditional dogmas about language and the mind. The first is Cartesianism regarding language.
Right, the idea that we have privileged internal access to linguistic facts.
If meanings are external causal modes, then my competence as a speaker doesn't give me tacit knowledge about the meaning.
Not at all. For instance, the meaning of gold is tied to its atomic number, 79, and its causal history. A speaker who is perfectly competent in using the word gold has no privileged internal access to the fact that its meaning is tied to its atomic structure.
So we have to abandon the idea of privileged internal access to linguistic facts.
We have to insist that the theory of language must be empirical. We have to look at usage, at history, at science, not just our own intuition.
And the second dogma we have to reject is narrow semantics,
Which says that the meanings relevant for psychological explanation are internal to the head. They're common to a person and their twin Earth counterpart.
Right. The twin Earth thought experiment is designed to establish this narrow meaning. So Oscar on Earth uses water, which is H-0. Oscar on twin Earth uses water, which is XYZ. The narrow dogma says their mental states are identical.
Because everything in their heads is the same.
But, as we noted, their intentional behavior is different. Oscar is fetching HO when he goes to get water. Twin Oscar is fetching XYZ.
So if we want a scientific psychological explanation for intentional behavior, like why Oscar decided to fetch water for his thirsty friend, we need that external referential connection to HO.
We need wide meanings.
We do. If we restrict our explanations to narrow meanings, we're left explaining only what you could call proto-intentional behaviors. That is, intentional behaviors stripped of their real-world referential content.
Which isn't very helpful.
Not at all. Scientific psychology, social science, folk psychology, they all successfully explain action by relying on wide meanings, connecting beliefs directly to real-world objects. It's the wide causal meaning that lets us understand why Oscar's intention resulted in him physically interacting with HO and not XYZ.
So in order to successfully explain why people do what they do, their language has to be causally anchored to the world.
It must. And this problem gets even worse when you consider how often we rely on reference borrowing. Since borrowing is unconscious and so prevalent, the narrow meanings of many of our terms, the purely internal descriptions and stimulus responses, they become highly generalized and vague.
And the wide meaning, rooted in that external causal history, is often the only robust thing left to explain successful intentional action.
It is. It's what's doing all the heavy lifting.
Okay, we've established the causal chain is paramount for proper names. Now let's pivot to descriptive phrases, specifically definite descriptions like the F or the thief. And here we have to return to Donnellan's distinction.
Right. Donnellan first observed this ambiguity in how we use descriptions.
And what was that ambiguity?
He observed that definite descriptions have two distinct uses. They can be used attributively. This is the classic Russellian quantificational use. It refers to whatever uniquely fits the description.
For example, the winner of the lottery will be rich. I don't know who that person is, but the description is what matters.
Exactly. Or they can be used referentially, which is designational. This is when the description is used to express a singular thought and designate a particular object the speaker has in mind, even if the description is technically inaccurate.
And the famous scenario here is the woman referring to her lover as her husband because she mistakenly believes he is her husband.
And she successfully refers to the lover even though the description, her husband, does not uniquely fit him.
The controversy then is not whether this referential use happens, I mean, it's ubiquitous, but whether this referential use, or RD, is a literal semantic meaning, so a real linguistic rule.
Or merely a sophisticated Grecian pragmatic implicature, a clever conversational move.
And we are firmly arguing that RD is semantic.
Yes. Let's detail the compelling case for it being semantic. The first argument is the argument from convention.
Okay, so referential uses of definite descriptions are absolutely pervasive. They are regular conventional practices that don't require elaborate stage setting or, deep, slow cognitive calculations.
And If an expression is regularly and successfully used in a specific way, it's overwhelmingly likely that this practice has conventionalized into a semantic rule.
To suggest otherwise would be implausible.
To suggest that a successful, universally common linguistic practice has somehow failed to conventionalize its meaning is, well, it's highly implausible. The default position should be that regular use equals semantic convention.
And the comparison to demonstratives argument 3 provides some structural proof for this. It shows that referential descriptions behave exactly like terms we already accept as singular and semantic.
That's right. Referential definite descriptions behave just like complex demonstratives, like that F. Both rely on a singular thought and a perceptual causal link to the object the speaker has in mind for reference fixing.
And since we accept that that F semantically refers via this direct causal link,
we should grant the same semantic status to the referential the F. Structurally, they're doing the same referential work.
Okay, now we have to address the gration challenge. This is the powerful counter-argument that these are just conversational tricks. Why can't we just explain referential use as a conversational implicature?
Well, the pragmatic strategy suggests that the speaker literally says the Russellian general proposition, the descriptive meaning.
But implies the singular proposition about the object they have in mind.
Correct. And we have three, I think, crushing objections to this view.
The first being the psychological reality objection.
The Gratian account places a huge and often unrealistic cognitive burden on the listener. It requires the listener to calculate this implicature in real time.
So first, hypothesize the literal Russellian meaning. Second, realize that meaning fails or is unsuitable in the context. And third, deduce the speaker's singular thought instead.
For the rapid-fire success of conversation, this hypothesized complex calculation just lacks any psycholinguistic support. Communication is far more immediate than this process would allow.
And the second objection, the Occam's developmental objection, brings us back to regularity.
Right. If the regular practice of using descriptions referentially is so pervasive, think about a well-established in-joke or a location nicknamed by a small group. If that communication strategy is successful and consistent, it becomes conventionalized.
It just becomes what the word means in that context.
It's implausible that a robust linguistic pattern would persist for decades purely as an implicature without becoming a semantic rule. We shouldn't invoke these complex, non-semantic mechanisms when a simple semantic rule explains the regularity so much better.
And the third objection hits the fundamental structural requirement of Gratian pragmatics, the say-imply flaw, especially with incomplete descriptions.
This is a structural breaking point. For a speaker to imply something singular, a Q proposition, they must also be conventionally conveying a general proposition, a P proposition.
Okay.
But consider an incomplete description, like pointing to a man in a crowded room and saying the man is late. What general proposition is the speaker literally saying that forms the foundation for the implication?
Well, if the speaker is saying the unique man in the entire world is late, that's obviously false and absurd.
Right.
And if the speaker is saying the unique man in the restricted domain is late, that requires a restriction on the domain which often doesn't exist explicitly in the utterance or the context.
The Gratian account fails to identify a plausible, complete, general proposition that the speaker is ostensibly saying while implying the singular one. If you can't establish what the speaker literally said via the descriptive content, the whole pragmatic strategy collapses. There's no foundation to build the implicature on.
All of this leads to what seems like the most devastating empirical blow against the Russellian approach, the devastating problem of incomplete descriptions when they're used referentially.
We can apply the same logic that broke description theories for proper names, ignorance and error.
So when descriptions are used referentially, the Russellian view requires some mechanism, implicit or explicit completion, to make the description unique.
But speakers routinely rely on singular thoughts, despite being ignorant of the precise facts they would need for that Russellian domain restriction.
They might refer to a specific person as the old enemy, but not know the person's real name or location or other unique characteristics needed to satisfy a general proposition. The required general knowledge is just absent.
And furthermore, they provide erroneous descriptions when using them referentially. A speaker might successfully refer to Jones, who is wearing a black suit, as the man in the blue suit.
And under the Russellian view, that utterance should fail to refer because the description doesn't fit.
Exactly. Since referential description, or RD, relies purely on the singular thought, the successful causal link to the object in the speaker's mind, rather than the successful fitting of the description, RD is the only viable semantic explanation that can handle these errors and ignorance.
So the descriptive content is merely a tool for identification, not the determiner of reference.
That's it. We can still hope to solve the problem for attributive incomplete descriptions, those used generally, within the Russellian framework by appealing to contextual restriction. But for referential incomplete descriptions, the singular causal link is really the only explanation that survives the empirical test of ignorance and error.
The concept of rigidity was one of Kripke's greatest contributions. Let's formally define a rigid designator and then explore how this concept extends beyond names.
Okay. A rigid designator, like the name Aristotle, designates the same object in every possible world where that object exists. The reference is fixed by the object itself, independent of any description.
In contrast to a non-rigid description like the heaviest Roman emperor, which could designate a different person in different possible worlds.
Exactly.
So if that's how names work, how can this concept apply to general terms? To kind of terms like tiger or gold, which don't designate a single specific object?
We extend the concept using rigid application. A general term rigidly applies if it applies to all and only the things that share the underlying necessary essence of that kind.
So gold rigidly applies to anything with atomic structure 79, regardless of its appearance in a different possible world.
Correct. And the primary function of rigidity here is methodological. It helps us distinguish terms that resist description theories from those that are description dependent.
You also introduced the concept of weak rigidity for singular terms like demonstratives or referential descriptions. What distinguishes them from the strong rigidity of names?
Terms like that murderer or referential the murderer are weakly rigid. They retain their referent across possible worlds only if the descriptive element of the term still applies to the object in that world.
So if we imagine a world where the person I referred to as that murderer was in fact framed and innocent,
then the term that murderer would cease to designate him in that world.
So weak rigidity shows that while the referential description, RD, is semantic, it connects to the object in my mind, it's still fundamentally tied to the descriptive content in a way that the name Aristotle is not.
Exactly. The descriptive content acts as a condition for application in other possible worlds, whereas for a proper name, the reference is unconditional.
All right, let's tackle the challenge posed by manufactured goods, artifactual and hybrid kinds. If gold is rigid because of its deep essence, what about something like a television set or a paperweight?
Artifactual terms, or what we call implement terms, are typically not rigid appliers.
Why not?
Because the essence of an implement kind is its function. A paperweight's defining function is, well, securing papers. However, that function is not essential to the object itself.
That is a crucial metaphysical distinction. The physical object I use is a paperweight. Let's say it's a unique, smoothly worn river stone. That object could exist in a possible world where it was left on the beach and never secured a single document.
And in that alternative world, the stone object would not count as a paperweight. The term paperweight applies only to objects in that world that are fulfilling the function.
Therefore, the term is not rigidly applied to that specific object across all worlds where the object exists.
Which demonstrates that kind terms for implements, being fundamentally functional, successfully resist being classified as rigid appliers.
Finally, we turn to terms that are neither pure natural kinds nor pure implements. The hybrid kind terms like frog and rice.
These terms show that the reference determination mechanism is not monolithic. It's not one size fits all. Take frog. It generally behaves like a causal kind term, but its reference is partially determined by a descriptive element.
Which is?
It has to refer to the adult frog stage of the organism, excluding the tadpole stage. If you point to a tadpole and say, that's a frog, you are not strictly referring to the kind in its canonical form.
So the mode of reference for frog is a hybrid. It requires both a causal link to the species lineage and a descriptive filtering element about its life cycle stage.
And rice is perhaps the clearest example of a hybrid term in common use. Its meaning is determined by a practical mix of superficial descriptive factors, its look, its use as food, its green characteristics, and deep causal factors, like its genetic origins as Oryza sativa.
So if a plant had the exact genetic makeup of rice, but tasted like wood chips and was poisonous, a casual user might deny that it was rice.
They probably would, yes. Which shows the descriptive functional component is highly active in how we use the word.
This entire framework that we've been building relies on a commitment to a naturalistic methodology. We have to reiterate that philosophy of language is an empirical scientific endeavor. It's not one that should rely on purely internal armchair reflection.
We must reject the Cartesian approach entirely. Language is a natural phenomenon. It's a system that evolved to play crucial causal roles in communication, and to understand it, we must study behavior and historical usage, not just our own internal introspection.
This directly leads to the rejection of the voice of competence, or OC, that Cartesian dogma that competence with the language guarantees privileged access to semantic facts. Why do we need to distrust our intuitions, especially in these philosophical thought experiments?
Because linguistic intuitions are fallible, empirical judgments. If I ask you if you can see a tree, your intuition is reliable. But if I ask for your intuition about the semantic status of the name Gödel in a twin Earth scenario,
My intuition is probably contaminated.
it's highly likely to be contaminated by folk theories or by confusing meaning with identification. We should seek direct evidence by studying large-scale linguistic usage, actual behavioral data from corpora and elicited production experiments.
And this is where experimental semantics steps in, testing the causal theory against real usage patterns.
Yeah.
Let's look at two famous case studies that support anti-descriptivism for proper names: the Tsu-Chong-Chi and Ambiorix experiments.
These experiments were designed to isolate the borrowing mechanism and test its resistance to descriptive error. In the Tsu-Chong-Chi test, participants were first exposed to a name linked to a set of descriptions, say, a 5th century Chinese astronomer.
Okay.
Later, they were told that historical evidence revealed the initial referent was actually a completely different later historical figure, or that the descriptions they learned were just false.
And the crucial question was, when participants were asked about the person Tsu-Chong-Chi, did they refer to the person who fit the descriptions they learned, or the person established by the expert causal chain?
And the results confirmed strong anti-descriptivist tendencies. Competent speakers successfully borrowed the reference to the actual historical person, demonstrating that the name's reference is governed by the causal historical network. It overrides the incorrect descriptions provided to the participants.
And the Ambiorix results showed something similar.
Yes, similar evidence. The reference is robustly causal, at least for borrowing.
So if borrowing is so robustly causal, does it apply even to those artifactual functional terms we just discussed, the implement terms?
That's a great question. We had argued that implement terms like fax machine or abacus are descriptively fixed by their function, but are not rigid appliers. The question remained. Once fixed, are they borrowed causally or descriptively?
And what did the experiments on these implement terms reveal about borrowing?
They showed decisively that reference borrowing applies to them, confirming the causal nature of transmission.
How do they test that?
Participants were provided with vignettes about fax machines and asked to ascribe thoughts about them, even when the vignettes contained ignorance or error about the machine's physical characteristics or its function.
So a participant could successfully use the term fax machine, even if they were under the impression that the machine used, say, pigeons for transmission. That would be a huge error about its function.
That is correct. They successfully referred to the conventional object. And this is a critical result because it supports the widespread applicability of the causal theory for borrowing, even if the original fixing of the term was descriptive.
So once the functional description, the fixing mechanism, has done its job to ground the term,
the historical causal chain takes over for transmission. It proves that borrowing relies on the causal network, not on constantly verifying the functional description.
Finally, let's revisit the hybrid case that tested rice versus the exotic plant Rio de Janeiro myrtle. This was designed to test whether the mixed nature of a term affects how its reference is determined at usage.
Right, and the experiments confirmed that Rio de Janeiro myrtle, a species thought extinct but rediscovered via genetic analysis, is treated by speakers as purely causal historical.
So they deferred to the science.
They did. Participants borrowed its reference based on its underlying genetics and lineage, even when shown specimens that superficially looked nothing like the traditional samples. The causal chain governs.
And rice confirmed its proposed hybrid status.
It did. Usage experiments confirmed that the reference determination for rice is mixed. while speakers do defer to its genetic lineage, the deep causal factor.
They're also heavily influenced by its superficial characteristics.
Look, its taste, its use as food, those are the descriptive functional factors. The willingness of participants to categorize an object as rice drops significantly if the object failed to meet the descriptive, practical requirements, even if it met the genetic ones.
Which confirms that kind terms really do vary in their reference mechanism. It's not one size fits all.
Not at all.
Now, this whole shift toward experimental usage, while scientifically crucial, introduces a fascinating methodological complexity. It highlights just how tricky it is to test semantics in practice, and that is the implicit scare quote problem.
This is a persistent headache in designing tests that are based on thought ascriptions. Suppose you, the participant, are an expert, and I ask you to ascribe a belief to a character, let's call her Dr. Marcus, who uses the name Beyoncé but associates highly incorrect descriptions with her.
Okay.
If you say Dr. Marcus believes that Beyoncé is F, there's a risk of interpretation error.
And the risk is that I, the participant, may not be using Beyoncé to refer to the pop star, but rather I'm using the name as a quote of the character's usage.
Exactly. You may implicitly be putting scare quotes around the name, describing the character's thought in the character's terms, what the character calls F, while distancing yourself from the name's actual conventional reference.
And if that's happening, the result doesn't confirm anti-descriptivism.
It just confirms that people are good at indirect reporting of speech.
So even successful experimental data, like the Tu Chong-chi results, has to be viewed through this lens. It requires increasingly sophisticated experimental design to ensure that the participant is truly referring to the conventional referent, and not just accommodating the character's idiosyncratic usage.
The external causal chain is complex, and as it turns out, testing it is equally so.
We've covered a vast journey today, detailing the shift from the internal description model to the external causal model.
We have, and I think the central takeaway is that this revolutionary move to external causal modes is absolutely necessary to explain successful reference, cognitive significance, and intentional behavior in the real world.
So the true semantic meaning of a word is the external causal mode of reference, that specific historical network.
And that is what makes an astronomical discovery like Hesperus Phosphorus informative.
That model forces us to abandon that cozy, self-contained Cartesian idea that we have privileged internal access to linguistic meaning. Instead, we have to look empirically at how our words are historically grounded and borrowed in the world.
And we saw that this causal mechanism applies strongly to borrowing, even for terms that resist rigid application, like implemented artifacts. And we learned that many common terms, like rice, are true hybrids, relying on both causal history and descriptive reality for their determination.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, navigating a world where gaining knowledge means mastering increasingly specialized terminology? We've seen that the successful use of terms, from Aristotle to Rice, depends not just on the knowledge in your head, but on correctly linking into an external causal history, often grounded by experts.
I mean, if you are competent with a term like elm or Cicero, you share the semantic meaning with the expert, despite being personally ignorant or error-prone, simply because your ability to use the word is chained to the community's successful usage.
Knowledge, then, is less about having perfect internal descriptions and more about maintaining a functional connection to the shared external reality established through history and empirical grounding. So consider this. If even a word as simple as rice has a hybrid determination mechanism, how much of your understanding of complex technical fields relies not on your descriptions of the facts, but on correctly linking yourself to the historical, causal chain of the specialized jargon?
Does gaining knowledge mean knowing the facts or simply knowing how to defer to the causal history that fixed the facts?
That's something to mull over the next time you reference HEO.